when the decision just personal decisions. Maybe you have disagreements with how they want to parent their kids. So how do you balance this autonomy of the individual and not infringing or imposing yourself? And you kind of talk about roles of experts, but kind of how do you decide if you are like the moral arbiter to kind of question this person? Why is it that your opinion on the matter like is important? And another one is you talk about like difference in approach, and then my question is just like, do you still have that same obligation with someone you're close to versus a stranger? Is it still as imperative that you kind of question their beliefs on the matter?
Yeah, and just to add on, Team B made an insightful point about you should speak up if the matter being talked about is dangerous or harmful, the subject matter, right? And so what about in times when it's like when one person believes in homeopathic or cultural or spiritual practices? Would you agree that it's important to speak up in those instances too if you disagree with them? Or is it rather more important to have like, how do you engage in productive dialogue in that aspect when you are rooted in different values and not in facts?
Yes, and then I also just have one more question for you, just about just the question itself. It asks like, how, if at all, is public health different from other things we might disagree about? So my question is, are public health discussions more important to have than disagreements about things like politics and the economy? Because obviously, like as you've already said, like public health is kind of like an issue that's very widespread. Like it doesn't just affect like one person; it has widespread repercussions. So then, are you saying that it is more important to kind of challenge issues about public health, even if it could like lead to potential disagreements, rather than perhaps like maybe like shelving off to the side discussions about like politics or the economy if they're liable to kind of create an environment where it's not productive to talk about it?
And lastly, if you're fundamentally disagreeing about objective truths, is that still a discussion worth having? If like, how do you move on from that if you cannot fundamentally come to agreement about facts or widely kind of accepted scientific truths? Are those still discussions that you have an imperative to kind of insert yourself in or declare yourself to be the expert on their situation? So we look forward to hearing your reply. Thank you, and we yield any remaining time.
Judges, please write down your scores for Team B's commentary. Team A, you will now have 1 minute to confer. Team A is the only team allowed to speak during this time. Your time begins now. All right, that's time.
Thank you.
All right. Team A has 3 minutes to respond to Team B's commentary. Any member of your team may speak one at a time. I will give you a reminder at 1 minute.
Thank you, Team B, for your questions. We sort of wanted to begin with something you brought up in two of your questions, the one about homeopathy and the one about autonomy. We feel that the stakes with public health differ because a vaccination isn't just protecting oneself, but it's also impacting one's community. This would be the same for, say, parenting a child, which is the example you used. It's not just them impacting themselves. If it's, say, an individual wanting to wear a seatbelt or not, that's something that impacts them specifically and directly and solely. So autonomy, we would like to preserve the autonomy of the individual and not question choices or not overly criticize choices which are solely impactful to them. However, with public health and a variety of other topics, including politics and economics, the stakes are just so much higher and so much wider.
Yeah, and just to expand on that a little bit more, you mentioned our public health conversations more important or as important as other conversations like politics or beliefs. And we see that all conversations are important and worth having, but public health obviously has a sort of an immediate risk due to, you know, the spread of a disease. If someone is unvaccinated and is going to a family event, that does have an immediate risk. But other conversations like politics and others can have a risk in the long term. So they're all important conversations to be having with your family. And then to add on to that, you asked if we have the same obligation to a stranger. And we say, no, you don't, because your family cares for you and you care for your family. So you have more of a emotional, societal obligation to the people who care for you, who raise you, than you do for, you know, someone on the bus who maybe disagrees with your beliefs.
To touch on the question about should we still discuss when you know our base values are so different about something? If someone thinks culturally while someone thinks more scientifically, we think that yes, you should still participate in a discussion, perhaps maybe trying to be more respectful and understanding. But it's important that when we discuss, we bring the feeling of inquiring and learning more than just trying to attack a person or make them wrong.
Thank you. So about the point about idealism, that's something we struggled with immensely in our discussions, was how can we practically ask people to, say, broach a contentious subject with their family members. And so with our approach, we do just want to make sure that people, when broaching those subjects, have a good approach, they're respectful, they're open-minded, and we don't feel that's idealistic to try and ask people to generally be respectful, to be good faith in their discussions. It's just a characteristic that everybody should ideally have just in their day-to-day lives. That's a hard word to say.
This change towards more constructive and respectful dialogue absolutely has to begin with the media we consume and the presentations of conflict, argument, and conversation that we consume on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judges, please write down your scores for Team A's response. I will give you 1 minute, and then we'll move on to judges' questions. Now the judges will have an opportunity to ask Team A questions. The question and answer session may be up to 10 minutes long. Each judge may ask one question and one brief follow-up question. Each judge's Q&A will be allocated the same amount of time. Judges, would you like 1 minute to confer? Are the judges ready?
So another interesting question that we have to ponder, what I'd like you to maybe elaborate a little bit more on, if you could, is the risk of non-engagement. So we've talked about, engaging, and that always seems important, but for the average person and the impact that they're going to have on the outcome of a public health type of issue, what is the risk of non-engagement to the individual and to the society?
Yeah, thank you. So the risk of non-engagement is that the people who speak the loudest, who might have vitriolic opinions, who might have an agenda in talking about public health. So just looking at the COVID pandemic, say somebody trying to sell you silver water, those voices will then be heard much louder than what the general public thinks. So the issue with disengagement is that it means that there is this opportunity for bad actors to then have their voices heard instead of what should be listened to.
Sorry. We also see that for other issues other than public health, the risk of non-engagement is as serious, well, maybe not as immediate. We talked a lot yesterday about voting and the issues with an uninformed vote. And if you're not having conversations about, why you're voting or why you make the political decisions you do, you risk a voter base that isn't informed. And the same applies to many other serious issues that we end up discussing at family dinner all the time.
We do recognize, though, that engagement isn't always easy to ask people to do. I mean, in family settings, that there are risks of severing ties. We've seen this with the U.S., severe tensions between Democratic and Republican family members. We feel that there's often a conflation between discomfort and actual harm. And we think that losing a family member over a disagreement is harm which is too great to ask someone to incur for the sake of engagement. However, an awkward conversation, for instance, is not reason enough to avoid such a conversation.
Yeah, with disengagement, it's just very easy, especially with contentious issues, to just throw up your hand and say, yep, I don't know, I'm just not going to put my horse in the game. It's just, I don't even want to touch it, especially with how, as Bella mentioned, divisive politics is nowadays. It is just, I've talked to a lot of people. I volunteer politically, so I've talked to people on the doorstep, and they're almost always, like most people you talk to, is just like, I don't want to discuss politics because I'm afraid that, the opinion I give will then be attacked. And so with this divisive type of politics, then it risks, as your question touched on, disengagement. And we want people to engage. We want people to have their voices heard. With engagement, we want to make sure that people make an informed decision about their health and make sure that when they're talking about public health in their conversations with others, that they're making their interests heard so that everybody in our society then knows what's best for each other. Because with more engagement, we just understand each other better because of the discussions we have. Yeah.
No. Thank you. All right.
Great. Thanks very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask about what respect requires of us in relationships with family members and whether that's consistent with what you're suggesting in terms of occupying this position of educator or position of authority over a family member, because I can imagine this coming across as condescending to some family members, right? So, if I'm at dinner with a relative and they have different beliefs than me about vaccines and, I'm like lecturing them or something, even if I'm trying to do it in a nice, friendly way, they might come away from that feeling like they've been talked down to or something. They're like, oh, Elliot thinks that he's smarter than me and he has better information than me. He's better at judging which sources are credible than me. And they might feel insulted by that, right? So could that be disrespectful? Like, what does respect actually require of me in that situation?
Thank you for your question. An educator role takes two forms. They're institutionally, for example, a virologist in a conversation about vaccines. They hold particular authority as an expert. but also a parent over a child holds educational authority. When we're talking about the role or the duty to educate, that takes place in sort of those situations. If it's more of a horizontal relationship, say me and a cousin, the duty becomes to question and to discuss. So we feel that in situations where education, and not speaking down to, but speaking to in that way, is commonplace or even necessary, it's not a faux pas, or it's not unethical to patronize. However, in a more horizontal situation, it would be.
We also see that in situations where condescension can happen, like, as a young person speaking to my grandparents, it's often hard to get my opinion out because, they have more life than me and they have more experience. But in both situations, we should be modeling, respectful dialogue, listening, even if you are an expert, understanding, even if you are an expert. Like, what the other person has to say is valid and is valuable to hear to increase your perspective as well.
Yeah, and another point we had in our discussion was this type of dual obligation. So the listener has an obligation to participate, to try and speak up, so that they're not just getting lectured to, and that the person speaking has to also make sure that their listener is engaged, that what they're saying isn't just some long tirade, and trying to make sure that when they're giving information, they're doing so in a productive manner. What's my other point?
Yeah, okay, sure. And one final point on this. We just listened to a talk by Nick Fillion earlier on conspiracy theories, and part of what he was saying was that you can't discredit all theories because sometimes we find them to be true later on, and to have a totally dismissive outlook is not really in the spirit or interest of intellectual conversation. We feel that this transfers into our conversations with family members, so even if you are, an institutional expert in a thing, you should be willing to hear what other people who may not have your sort of prowess or prestige, what they have to say on topics. It's sort of part of your duty as an intellectual. Thank you.
I'm going to change my question a bit because I want to ask kind of a follow-up to this question. How might your duty change when that relationship you are talking about or the responsibility of the listener isn't honored? So when the person or the people or the community that you're engaging with is being abrasive, is being offensive, is refusing to acknowledge your viewpoints or other, commonly held facts around public health, and is asserting opinions or beliefs that are harmful, then how does your duty change?
Thank you. Great question. We talked a lot about this. If I'm trying to model good conversation and Bella is being rude or abrasive or not listening to me, is that a conversation worth having? And we came to the conclusion that, if your partner in conversation isn't being receptive, you try as much as you can and then you stop. And because they're your family, you're going to have another opportunity to have this conversation. It doesn't need to be everything all at once to try to change someone's mind. It can be small conversations, small mentions, discussions, trying to get people to an even ground where they feel respected enough to treat you with respect, and you are able to, maintain a conversation, learn about their perspective, learn about your perspective in an environment that is positive.
Also, in approaching conversations in inquisitive ways, we sort of avoid the spinning in circles where you have two opinions clashing against one another. We see this so often in, American politics, which is bifurcated so heavily. We would like sort of one actor, ideally both, but one actor to be inquisitive, and we feel that this would generally avoid some of the more wheel-spinning conversations, which we find to be unproductive and often damaging.
We also want to make it clear that when you have, say, a loud, angry family member trying to make their opinion the only one heard, you still have the obligation in that setting to make your voice heard. You can't just let them be the sole speaker. You need to have your viewpoint shared so that people, say, around the table who might be listening don't just get this one family member's ideas. You want to make sure that it is as well-rounded, the conversation is as well-rounded as you can make it to be. So while you might not necessarily have to continue trying to pursue the conversation further if it is just becoming completely unproductive, you still want to make sure that you stay strong and don't just completely roll over.
Yes, and we extend that basically as far as genuinely harmful responses. Speaking up to a very loud family member is one thing, but if you're in a spousal relationship and you're speaking to, say, an abusive partner, your obligation changes. You no longer have an obligation to question your rights to self-preservation trump your duties to the collective, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judges, please score Team A's responses to your questions, and I'm going to give you 1 minute before we move on to part 2. I'm going to pass out the case. We already know. Don't turn it over till I've read the question. I will now read the case and question for Team B. The case is number 8, Public Health Measures on Farms. And the question is, should we do more to publicly recognize the role of the farm industry in pandemic prevention efforts? Just one more time. Should we do more to publicly recognize the role of the farm industry in pandemic prevention efforts? All right, Team B, you now may have up to 2 minutes to confer with each other before beginning your presentation. Either team may take notes, but Team B is the only team allowed to speak during this time. Your time starts now. All right, that's time. Team B now has 5 minutes to make its presentation. Any member of the team may speak one at a time. Team B, I will give you reminders when there are 3 and 1 minute remaining. And your time starts now.
Well, firstly, thank you again, Team A. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. And coming from Alberta, obviously lots of farms, lots of rural communities. So obviously this case and issue presents quite a relevant question about, do we need to put a bigger burden essentially, or a bigger imperative on the farming and agricultural business in pandemic prevention efforts, especially because they're working with livestock, with packaging goods and materials and things of this nature. So I think the first thing that's just important to highlight is the difference between the obligations of small local farmers and these large corporations, because naturally if you have less resources, less people, you're going to feel less of a need to be spending, money and resources towards these prevention efforts, especially if it's not an imminent threat to yourself or others. So I think it's just important for the government to recognize this, and if they want to increase kind of these prevention efforts, they should be targeting towards the smaller people that cannot self-sustain these practices by themselves. And I think the second thing that's really important is to build kind of respect in urban cities for the farming community, because I think a lot of the times when you have lots of like rural communities isolated from urban communities, there's a big disconnect about how each other impacts one another. So I think it's a two-way street. I think urban cities need to recognize the role of farmers in their everyday lives and the imperative they hold. And likewise, if farmers, sometimes if they're in small, reserved local communities, sometimes they don't see what a big impact their actions can have globally. So I think that's just really important that both recognize the role they play and to build that kind of empathy.
Yes, and just more so on this point about recognition, right? We see that when you kind of recognize the roles that these farmers have and like how kind of important they are to mitigating like the potential spread of this pandemic, it can kind of lead to like wider recognition for what they do. So what I mean by this is that a big issue with this topic of discussion is about how, sometimes culling livestock can have like profound financial implications on these farmers. But then if there's more recognition for their efforts, then the government is more likely to kind of take a stance to kind of mitigate some of these like financial implications. Because if the wider public is seeing that like this affects how farmers can kind of make money, it can lead to like more and more advocacy efforts to try to mitigate the harms that these farmers may potentially face. And then it can also kind of lead to like the development of kind of better administering of these like vaccines and like public health efforts. So people might be advocating for like things such as like mobile clinics and things of this nature to kind of go out into these rural communities and provide vaccinations for these farmers, because then they're recognizing the fact that this is like kind of like a global effort, right? So then, and it starts like with the people who are living on these farms.
Yeah, and just to add on to my partner's points, it's very important to recognize that farmers have a role, but so does every citizen, right? During COVID, we saw how it was so it was so important for everyone to engage in hand washing, wearing masks, not coming to school when they were sick, and things of that nature. It's very important to do those things, and many individuals were not doing those things before COVID, and it's important to inform the public so that if there is a case of a health emergency, then we can act immediately and we can stop the spread immediately instead of later on having to educate the public during the spread, and maybe that could lead to more deaths and worse community.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, like, should more be done? We think so, but just the way that it's being done, it can't just be a unilateral thing. We can't just target this one industry and put all the burden on them. It has to be a collective effort towards it. And we also have to recognize that the needs of people in the farming industry are very different, especially if you have lots of undocumented or migrant workers working on these farms. Naturally, their sense of obligation for getting vaccinations and things of this nature are different. So then we have to look at how the government can approach this issue with compassion and recognition, and once again recognize, like, yes, there's great potential for pandemics when you're working with livestock and things of this nature, but if urban communities as well are not recognizing what they can do, as my partner said, like more educational efforts to encourage hand washing, preventative measures, and also for them to want to see better working conditions for people on these reserves, nothing will be accomplished. So for all those reasons, thank you, and we yield any remaining time.
Thank you very much. All right. Judges, please mark your scores for Team B's presentation. Team A, you will now have 1 minute to confer. Either team may take notes, but Team A is the only team allowed to speak during this time. Your time begins now. All right. Team A, you now may have up to 3 minutes to respond to Team B's commentary presentation. Any member of your team may speak one at a time. Team A, I will indicate when you have 1 minute remaining.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was really interesting. We grappled with a lot of these thoughts as well. We thought about, what can farmers do? What can citizens do? And we ended up with this question of, if farmers aren't immediately being held accountable, if they aren't immediately enacting vaccines and culling, what can a citizen do? Because if you're being sold infected food, if you're being distributed products that aren't good, or if food prices are spiking, what control do we have over this pandemic, and what actions can you take as an individual citizen?
Also, you guys mentioned the risks of perhaps imposing a bigger burden on farmers. And we wanted to sort of focus in on the publicly recognized part of the question and ask about some of the forms that this sort of recognition could take, or to ask a more normative question, what forms it should take. We see there's already a precedent of a reciprocal relationship between farmers and the government. Farmers produce food, the government subsidizes them. Would you support perhaps more subsidies for farmers? Do you think that they, despite being in the private sector, deserve more government aid for the work that they're doing for the public? And if so, would you propose maybe shifting farming as an industry into the public sector, because we're already increasing restrictions, regulations, but also funding and subsidies and governmental aid?
In your presentation, you brought up the idea that we have to build respect for farms in cities, and we have to also be able to make sure that these farmers also get to see what the city, what they do for these cities. I wanted to bring up the idea of, so during COVID, during the pandemic, there was, it's always been a problem, but the problem was made a lot worse, where there was a major urban-rural divide. And the question I want to ask is, so a lot of the people in the cities, regardless of whether it was true or not, saw a lot of these, especially in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, I presume in Alberta as well, as these small farming towns as bastions of anti-vaccination sentiment. So how do we, regardless of whether that was true or not, so how do we resolve this issue of urban-rural divide in that situation?
Yeah, so two alternative perspectives that were touched on that we touched on in our discussions, that a couple of my colleagues touched on as well, was the two perspectives being whether we should recognize farmers more because they do provide an essential service, or whether we should recognize them less because they are very rich, they've gotten a lot of government subsidies, and they are for-profit organizations. So those were the two main alternative perspectives, were, again, whether recognizing them more or recognizing them less, depending on how we view their role in society to be.
You mentioned the obligation or the help needing to be sent mainly to smaller farms, and we do agree with this, but we also see that bigger farms make a lot of money, and they are huge. And what reasoning would they have, to spend money on expensive farming projects when they could go without?
Thanks. So much court.
I know. All right. Judges, please write down your scores for Team A's commentary. Team B, you will now have 1 minute to confer. Team B is the only team allowed to speak during this time. Your time starts now. All right. Team B now has 3 minutes to respond to Team A's commentary. Any member of your team may speak one at a time. Team B, I will indicate when you have 1 minute remaining. Oh.
Firstly, thank you so much for all of the questions. It really helps us kind of refine our case and recognize how we can move forward on this issue better. And the first thing that I just wanted to touch on was this like urban and rural divide, specifically between like difference of opinion and just kind of recognizing like general health sentiments or, you know, like public opinion or political things of this nature. We completely understand that this is like a very difficult thing to grapple with. And I think that it's also not productive if you have just like a body kind of impeding on these people and saying you're wrong, you need to change, because obviously that's not going to facilitate good change. So and I also wanted to touch on this a bit about, you were asking like, would we recommend more subsidies, more government involvement? We believe that because of this being like a public health measure, it is their obligation, but we do also recognize that they might not be as receptive if it is coming from like a big overseeing body. So we would hope that we could then kind of just get more local leaders in the communities to be the ones that are imposing these changes, right? Because if you have someone from the bureaucracy coming in, they're obviously going to have pushbacks. And so that like underlying assumption that these farmers are very like willing to accept all this aid, I think it's a little bit misguided, because I think a lot of the times they do want to preserve their own autonomy over their industry and things of this nature. So I think it's possible for them to enact their change their own. And the other thing I wanted to touch on are what can everyday citizens do if like these efforts are not being immediately recognized. I think that that's the importance of them recognizing the things that the farmers do for them, because then they will want to push for more action and things of this nature. And I still think, as my partner said, like with hand washing, proper hygiene, them still being in control of their actions still does contribute to the greater good. So I don't think that it's to waste.
Yes, and then just to touch on this point that you brought up about why would like rich farms want to spend money on defensive measures, right? Like what's the incentive to do that? And with this issue, we kind of see that if they're not taking action towards like preventative measures, that like the issue spirals out of control and it ends up costing them more and more money in the long run, because now you have to call your livestock, because if millions of livestock are like infested like with this disease, then it's not viable to kind of sell this livestock. So we see that there is like a greater incentive for them to take more preventative measures, because in the long run it saves them more money.
And lastly, just to touch on the points of like what forms of recognition can we give to these farmers, right? So we believe that education is very important, educating the public what is avian flu, right? And how does it affect you? Because that will make the public want to push for more protection from the government, and that will in turn make the government hopefully spend more taxes on this pressing issue. Now, we also believe that personal protective equipment and other subsidies are very important, not just for the farmers, but it affects everyone, right? And that just like how the government would provide masks in a school if there's an outbreak, because it affects everyone in that way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Judges, please write down your score for Team B's response. And I'm going to give you a minute, and then we'll move on to question period. All right. What am I looking at? All right. Now the judges will have an opportunity to ask Team B questions. The question and answer session may be up to 10 minutes long. Each judge may ask one question and one brief follow-up question. Each judge's Q&A will be allocated the same amount of time. Judges, would you like 1 minute to confer? Amazing. All right.
Okay, thank you. So we have another challenging question and session here for you, and we hope you enjoy just thinking these things through and stretching a little bit in your thinking. When we talked about this health issue, one element that we left out is the actual animal, the livestock themselves. So is there anything that we should be thinking about with respect to the rights or the well-being of the animal? And this might relate to a difference between large farm, small farm, that type of issue as well, if you could comment.
Thank you so much for the question and bringing up a totally different aspect of it that hasn't really been addressed yet. And yes, I think just as you said, it lies in the fact about the difference between these like larger farms and the smaller ones, because naturally if you're living on, like if you own like a local farm, family owned farm, we would like to think that, you know, you don't have as many resources to just kind of like discard of these like animals. You know, you would hope that you would have more of a tie and bond to them versus like these really big corporations where it's just in and out every day. They don't build a relationship with the animals. It's not much care, or it's not as big of a issue if there is a breakout, for example, to discard of them. So then the question is like, how can we protect the animals as well, that their well-being is protected? I think that in this discussion we can also start to bring in like animal rights activists, and also bring up how can the spread be contained in the animals themselves, not just what the people can do, but what we can do for living conditions of the animals to prevent that outbreak amongst them in the first place, or how like what diet we can feed them and things of that to keep them healthy.
Yes, and then kind of when like examining the animals, we see that like preventative measures become more and more important, because kind of when we're looking to humans, we're thinking about kind of like mitigating like the spread and not allowing it to spread from animals to humans. But when we look at the issue between animals, right, kind of taking these more preventative measures, it becomes even more and more important, because then you're kind of limiting the issue before it can even get to the level where humans are being affected, right? So by kind of focusing on the animals, we see that there's like a widespread effect where it's a net good. It's overall better for all parties involved if we kind of focus the issue from a bottom to top approach, rather than starting at the top and trying to kind of go to the bottom.
Thank you so much for your presentation. Yeah, so I guess I wanted to ask about what makes farms different from other productive industries here, because it kind of seems to me that, so you're emphasizing the need for empathy, for compassion and respect for farmers, which all sounds good, but then I wonder about, you know, it seems like we have a lot of collective sympathy for farmers that we might not extend to other people like drug manufacturers or car manufacturers or something, but these are also productive industries where their products can pose some serious risk to the public, right? And you might sort of have the perspective to play devil's advocate that like, look, this is a for-profit industry and they owe it to the public to make sure that the products that they're making are safe. And so that's not like them going above and beyond or something. That's like them meeting like the minimum requirements that we should expect of them. So yeah, what do you think about that perspective? And what do you think makes farms different if they are different? Maybe they're not. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. You know, like the question about like the unequal, like the burden that's placed on farms, like whether or not it is unequal, and whether or not like they are kind of deserving of this like compensation that we're speaking about. And we see that like in the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously like there was kind of like an unequal burden placed on like the healthcare sector and things of this nature. And then in the nature of kind of like limiting the spread of the bird flu, that burden is now placed on farms. And while we believe that yes, they do have the responsibility to kind of limit this spread, if we kind of want to see like meaningful change, there does have to be like some form of compensation, like especially for kind of smaller farmers where like this is kind of like their way of life, like their main sources of incomes and things of this nature. They might need greater incentives to kind of, you know, like be more involved in kind of limiting the spread of this as well.
Also, food is a really universal aspect, right? So everyone consumes food from these farmers, whereas not everyone has a car and not everyone uses drugs or things of that nature, right? So when the government is looking at what things to fund, they should fund things. We believe that they should fund things that benefit the broader societal good, and that farmers are for broader societal good. Everyone consumes food, so we think it's a very important issue to address.
Yeah, and I also think it touched on something that Team A brought up about if we're spending all this money anyways, why wouldn't we just want to shift more farms towards the public sector? But I think it's like during the pandemic, it's not like we saw private clinics starting to shift towards public ones, or we started to see more calls to see like the disbanding of that system. And so I think it is important to just overall, like as you said, grow more respect in general just for blue collar like workers. So the things we talked about, like these educational programs, I think they could extend to other industries. I think people, lots of the times when you go to school and post-secondary, you get this idea that there's only one pathway, and you don't recognize all the industries that sometimes don't get the credit they deserve. So as we talked about like educational opportunities, I think it would be valuable to extend those to other industries so we can just build more global citizens that kind of recognize the obligations they have to others.
Thanks. My question relates to much that was just discussed, and that's about, the obligation to recognize or support farmers. And I'm wondering if you could say more about where that obligation lies in terms of the state and the public system versus the private system, which of course includes the private enterprises that are farms.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Like the difference, kind of between like recognizing like the role of, private versus public, like when it comes to this issue. And we think that like kind of in this issue, right, it's like the issue of this kind of avian flu, it's not like going to be like a permanent thing. So momentarily shifting resources towards kind of recognizing like the role of farms more. We don't really kind of see this to be like something that's like too like unequal of a burden, because kind of like in limiting the spread of this flu, right, it takes more precedence kind of to tackle this issue, and we see that it has greater importance and it has greater relevance in the moment.
Yeah, and I think even just referencing the pandemic and inequities in like response for private clinics or public hospitals which were like really strained during the pandemic, we can see that this transcends the issue of like public or private, and we just wanted to focus more so on the like size of the corporations, not necessarily the sector that we're in, because we think that just as like it's really easy to focus on divides between urban and rural in terms of like political ideology. It's really easy to get tied up in like, private and public. And so I think it's just important to recognize everyone has a role to play.
Yeah, and just to add on to my partner's points, COVID, as we saw in the pandemic, placed a high burden on healthcare systems, but eventually it is starting to die down as the cases go down, right? But the reason why it was so high in the first place, it was because we let COVID get to a point we didn't have a vaccine, but now we have a vaccine for the avian flu. We know how to deal with a pandemic better than we did before, so it's important to put those measures in place before and try to stop the spread before, so then we won't get to that place where our public health sector is overflowed, right?
Yes, and then I think it's also like kind of important to like recognize the difference between like equality and equity in this case, right? The amount of weight that you have like on the public and the private sector, it isn't necessarily going to be the same just because of like the means of both industry. It's not necessarily like the same amount. However, it is kind of important to expect them to kind of contribute like based on like their means and kind of have like an equitable impact on the issue, not necessarily one that's equal.
Thank you very much. I know this is when we typically move on to like talking with each other, but I do have questions that I'm going to force you guys to answer. And because I was told not to make you guys do more work, I'll be writing down your answers. So, all right. What's going to happen is I'm going to ask the question. I'm going to hand the microphone to each person. Make it kind of brief because there's 3 questions and a lot of people. All right. What did you learn from this conversation with each other? I'll start to my left.
I'm going to extend this into the case itself, not just the conversation. I think both researching both of these cases and then talking to you guys about them, especially considering you're Albertan. I mean, Manitoba's got its fair share of farms, but Alberta is different in a lot of ways, and part of that touches on the sort of agricultural sector. I think I've gained a better understanding for how to act as a citizen in relation to the systems and industries around me.
Great work, Bella. This case specifically, you asked a question about animal rights, and I hadn't thought about that at all in discussion, and it just like hit me in the face. I think it's so smart. So,
yeah, I think one thing that I learned about is that how, despite being so far apart, like you guys being in Alberta and we're in Winnipeg, we've come to similar ideas and we've had like, you know, such smart conversations, and yeah, I think that's really nice.
I think that on kind of the same stuff as Kirtan said, I think it's very interesting that in currently the society where it seems like everyone's so separate, yet we're two provinces apart, yet we're able to speak on very we're able to see the things that we have in common with each other. I think that's really cool, especially in such times like this, and it gives me hope for the future. Thank you.
Thank you. What did I learn? Good question. Sorry, that sounds bad. I apologize. It is a lot of the time there's all these different thoughts that then get tossed around, and then you just have to take the gems out of it, like sift the gold out. So it is a little bit difficult just right after the match to on the fly. Thanks, Annette. We appreciate you. It's your fault. No, just kidding. Did I learn some? Yeah, exactly, because there's some things that play crucial role, like people like farmers, like public health officials, like whatever it may be, media, who we constantly get information from. Well, sorry, not necessarily farmers. Sorry, I should rephrase that. There are these people who play important roles in our lives that we don't necessarily think about, and that, yeah, sure, whatever. I'll just finish with saying, yeah, it's just interesting to hear what you all found to be important, and just, again, shift out those little gems.
you also should stop talking.
I was talking to you. That was directed at you.
Yeah, I echo all of the sentiments from across the table, but I think what's really interesting about this pairing of cases is the first one dealt with more about like these disagreements in like as a hypothetical, you know, and then the next case talks about in practice. So I think in combination it forms for like just a really good overall view of kind of like how it's different when you're talking about these things as ideals or hypotheticals versus when it actually comes down to implementing them, and really how do we console with difference of opinions and when united action is required. So I think just the pairing of the cases was really good for that.
Yeah, just even to talk about the cases again, I feel like a common theme between both of the cases was this idea of duty, you know, like how do you tackle duty when it comes to like unequal approaches, or like this idea of like equality and equity, and, you know, what is fair to expect someone to do. And I just thought it was very interesting, like how, like, you know, in the first case when we were talking about, you know, family disagreements and vaccines, we were talking about like a more like familial sense of duty, and whether or not, you know, like your close relationships kind of, you know, changed like the way that you approach duty. And then here we're talking about like duty like on like a public kind of like scale, and kind of like your duty as a global citizen to other people around you. So I just thought it was very interesting how both cases tackle duty.
I just thought it was so interesting that like in our world today, it's like very polarizing to have these conversations and to debate people, or just to even have discussions with people. It often turns into an argument or a debate. So I thought it was really nice that we were able to have like a good discussion and explore diverse perspectives, especially as high school students. I think it's very, very nice to see that our future young leaders are probably gonna change the world.
Amazing. Next question. I said there was 3 when I started.
because she's the one that's like doing the graphic recording. You can like just one of you from the table can answer them. You all don't have to answer. One or two. I mean, if you like, you can all answer, but don't feel each person has to respond.
That is fair. Okay. Also, are you done with your scoring sheets? Can I take those? I mean, if you I can do it. Yeah, sure. That would be amazing. Thank you. All right. This makes my life easier. Okay. All right. What was a memorable moment from the match?
That question on animal rights, we had not talked about that, but it totally changes the imperative specifically for preventative measures on farms. And this case sort of gets at how sacrifices in a pandemic differ from sacrifices preventatively. And I think you just tied in a totally different ethical stake, pun intended, I guess, stake, which was great. It was so, I don't know, that like floored me. That was great.
I would have loved to got that question. It was
Yeah, it was awesome.
Amazing.
I hate to give a copycat answer, but being on the receiving end of that question and just be like, we did not prep anything similar to this. So yeah, that definitely stood out to me. And I think even like Team A, to give you guys credit, the one thing where you talked about should we just like shift it to the public sector, that was also just like a really great question that caught us off guard. So I think just like lots of really challenging, tough questions that you have to like think about quickly on the fly and just like stuff you didn't even prep for. So really good job. Yeah.
My writing is getting more illegible the longer we go. Okay. How did you feel when discussing these issues with your peers?
Well, with our peers in this team, we were having a lot of trouble. We really, these are the cases, we do good on some cases. These are the cases that we really were like thinking over, and we kept coming back to them. We kept putting them off and then going back to them. And we really only figured it out today, but we were asking a lot of questions about, you know, in both cases, obligation, duty, like you said, and then discussing with you guys. The Albertan perspective was really interesting because I forgot that you guys have private clinics. And when you mentioned that, I was like, what? But it is such a different system, and it's cool that we can meld those ideas. So those were things that came up with our peers.
Yeah, cool ideas on in our meetings and with you.
Okay, so for case 7, the one about family disagreement about vaccines, when we were initially prepping for this case, one discussion question really like caused a lot of argument between us. The one, is it easier to disagree about facts or values? And we kept going back and forth, and these two were kind of like stuck on facts or values. And like whenever like one of them would say something, like I would align with one of them, and then the other would say something, and I would like change my mind. It was just like, I don't think we actually like ever really reached like a conclusive answer about is it easier to disagree about facts or values. So yeah, that question was just like kind of very hard to tackle when we were initially prepping for this.
You can understand what it was saying. We were like, easier to disagree. Like, is the disagreement easier, or is it easier to have a disagreement? Like, you're like,
when people like disagree with things that like are scientifically proven, like it's harder to have a conversation with them and change their mind.
All values or all facts or values that we're disagreeing with. And now
Wait, that was the first.
In the presidential debates in the U.S., you saw one candidate, Trump, just lying, and it's so hard to disagree with someone who's just going to make up facts which make their position sound stronger.
Yeah.
Like, it's really, yeah.
Good thing none of us lied
Have you
today.
guys seen that one video of the flat earthers, and apparently like they were in the water and they were trying to like prove like something like that Earth was like not flat, that was flat, but then their experiment like proved that it was flat. And you think they still couldn't like reconcile the fact that the Earth was round.
Cognitive dissonance. Yeah.
So maybe there are disagreements between facts and values.
Sorry to ethics again.
New math.
Okay. That was the 3 questions.
Thanks, Annette.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Are all of the scores in? The scores are all in? Amazing. Okay. Oh, there's too many papers on this table. Okay. Thank you to both teams for a great round. The scores are in, and Kelvin High School is the winning team. All right. Let's have a big round of applause for both teams.
I had a question for you guys.
Do you want our papers? Do you want me to just drop them somewhere? Yeah.
Farmers need to purchase them as sort of part of their job. One of the judges' questions as well as something we touched on. Like a restaurant has a duty to have certain public health guidelines, and the government doesn't subsidize them. So the government shouldn't make the vaccines for bird flu. Okay. I think that's it. Healthcare, public service, public sector, food, public service, not public service. I just wanted to say, so as an editor from rather left it's interesting because it's like most concerns, I'll be honest, most conceptions of OnlyFans are not great. But I found it really cool to be able to just hear your views about it and disproving a lot of the misconceptions. It's really cool being able to hear all the views, and like I said, it's like we're not all actually that different from each other. So. Thank you. You guys are so great with it. Thank you so much. That was a lot of fun.
We're behind schedule a bit.
Oh, I know.
And parents are wanting to take their kids for lunch and come back a bit later since we're late. Where are we? Who would I ask? How about that?
I'd imagine they'd make an announcement. Because if it's
Tell you the judge said? No, that's actually, I'm asking if it's only supposed to be 20. Which,
well,
I'm wondering if they're going to delay
they've got to delay it.
I'm wondering who to ask about when.
Because I think they need that time to count. I'll see if I can find out. He's the math guy.
Okay. Would we ask what's delayed?
Yeah, I'll find out.
What time is it now?
Things come out of it.
Do you have the reflection-y stuff?
I tried to write down the important stuff.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yeah, less is more.
I know. It's just like a lot of people are saying the exact same thing.
Uh-huh.
So I was like, I should probably write down the quality.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for that. How are you feeling?
I'm doing okay.
You're done.
Yeah.
You made it.
I'm glad I did not. I went to bed at like 2 a.m.
Oh, no.
So
Okay.
I'm glad this is my last match.
Nice.
We were in the neighborhood and just dropped by. So what's that? They're on a break. Do you know who's made it to the final?
I don't. Who won this match?
Kelvin.
Calvin?
Yes.
Okay.
And
Well, who was the other team here?
Old Skona.